he went like this. So being a New Yorker, I went like that. And then he took out pepper spray and pepper sprayed me.
My guest today is Rabbi Michael Schudrich, a native New Yorker and graduate of both the Jewish Theological Seminary and Yeshiva University. Rabbi Schudrich went on to become the rabbi of the Jewish community of Japan before undertaking his current position as the longest-serving Chief Rabbi of Poland. Rabbi Schudrich, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you, Baruch Hashem. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So, Rabbi, let's start from the beginning. Almost right at the start of your rabbinical career, you found yourself faced with a huge responsibility. In 1980, you received your first rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and by 1983, you were the rabbi of the Jewish community of Japan. How did this happen?
Well, so the Jewish community of Japan is actually the Jewish community of Tokyo, and it's a smallish community. It's about 150 families. It's the kind of congregation that would naturally take someone very young in their career, except that it was Japan, so it was very different. And but being a rabbi anywhere is a huge responsibility. And it was the difference of doing it in Japan was that we had Jews from all over the world in a very different setting. We weren't at home. Most Jews that were there on assignments from companies for 2, 3, 4 years, and so that was an additional challenge. But some people enjoy challenges.
Yeah, are you one of them?
I guess so.
I mean, I'm very curious. What was it like serving a community largely made up of expats or people passing through, unless there was a community of native Tokyo Jews?
Okay, the community actually was started by Russian Jews who had fled the Soviet Union during the revolution, during 1917, and fled east, not west, ended up in China, and then stayed in China until the fall of China to Mao Zedong in 46, 47, where some of them, which was already a community from Shanghai, fled to Tokyo. Some went to Tokyo, some went to Hong Kong, some went to, it was not yet Israel, it was Palestine still in 46, 47, all over the world, but 50, 60 families went to Tokyo and then started the Tokyo Jewish community. However, most of their kids went abroad to study, so very few of them came back. So we had the old Russian Jewish families, where this was already in the 1980s. They had fled as children in 1917, and you had some of like a small part of the community was there for decades, but then you had lots already. Most of the community was transient. So what it really was challenging was how to create meaningful programming that was based on the people that were there now, but that could continue even after these people left. So it was not really often in communal work, you nurture people, your grassroots people to become leaders. And then you also, with them, you build programs. Here, it was really building programs using the people available right now, but knowing that you can't count on them being in 2, 3 years.
And did the environment, did the country you were in play a factor? That being Japan, I imagine there are less kosher resources for somewhere like America or the UK, for example.
Well, except for Israel, almost any country besides the United States or the UK or France has less kosher possibilities. But it wasn't so bad. We imported ourselves kosher meat, so that we took care of. And there were enough other things. It wasn't like living in Manhattan, where I'm from. Clearly, there's more kosher food there. But that wasn't the major issue. In terms of creating community, it was very interesting because you had some people who, far away from home, really needed more that sense of Jewish community, that feeling of home, the feeling of rootedness. And you had other people who were quite active Jewishly, but knew they were coming for 2 years. And so they said, well, this is, I'll certainly go to Shul, Rosh Hashanah, and Kippur, but the rest of the time I'd rather go around Japan and see Japan and take advantage of Japan. And therefore it lessened their Jewish activity. So you had the two opposite phenomena. Some people went that way, some people went the other way.
That's very interesting. You said that the kosher thing wasn't the biggest issue. I'm wondering what the biggest issue might be, or what some of the issues might be, and whether the public perception of Jews in Japan played a part. Were there any issues regarding to anti-Semitism there?
Okay. Uh, I would say the biggest issue is how to build a strong community with strong, creative programming when you can't count on the same people you're now working with being there in 6 months, a year, or 2 years. So that was really about creating um, sustainable programming, not based on the fact that you're going to have the same activists for 10, 20, 30 years. So I think that was for me the very big challenge. Uh, it was a challenge also the fact that, uh, you know, often on a Sunday or a weekend, people would want to go through something interesting Japanese. But there were enough people that also wanted to do something Jewish, so that wasn't really a very big issue. In terms of, for the most part, the Japanese have no idea who the Jews are, certainly in the 1980s. They're, white people with round eyes, not to be racist or stereotype, but that's what we are. And we have a Bible. We just have an old one, not the new one. It's like not a really big difference when you're coming from a Japanese Shinto Buddhist perspective. And so, for them, the difference between Jews and Christians were quite minimal. I mean, one group had a New Testament, the other one only had the Old Testament, but it's okay. I remember even conversations with some very sweet Japanese explaining to them. They ask, "How do we celebrate Christmas?" So I said, "We don't have Christmas." And explain why we don't have Christmas. And they say, okay, okay. So how do you celebrate Christmas? Um, of course, there are Japanese who have traveled abroad, certainly more so now than, it's already been 30 plus years since I left Japan. Uh, but in that time, there was it was still kind of they'd heard something about Jews. And then, of course, also towards the end of my stay in 87, 88, they began a rash of anti Semitic literature, which was very strange because there are so few Jews. But what it really was, it was at that time the Japanese currency, the yen, became very strong, which was a great problem for exports because while for the individual traveling abroad, if your currency is stronger, it's great. It has more value when you travel. But if you're exporting, that means that your markup is much less. And so it was considered a great problem, a challenge to the Japanese economy. And the yen really went much stronger against the dollar. And they were looking, why was this happening? What conspiracy was happening? Because, like in Japan and many other countries, they love conspiracy theories. And one conspiracy was that Rockefeller was doing it, another one, the Masons were doing it. And there was also a few writers who wrote about how the Jews were controlling the Japanese economy. However, that was very wrong, and we dealt with it, we fought with it. Uh, it never had any practical expressions. So it was anti Semitic literature without anti Semitic action.
You mentioned that you fought it, you combated it. What did that look like?
Well, it was doing our best to help people understand what was happening. What are the Jews really about? Uh, that we're something based on the five books of Moses. What are the religious values? What are our ethics? What is our history about? And it's in that sense to put it into a context so people could understand that this anti-Semitic literature is simply lying. But there were certain challenges. And for example, one thing we fought about was the definition of the word Jew in Japanese dictionaries would have also one of the definitions found in U.S. or U.K. Dictionaries, and that is to Jew someone down, which which unfortunately does exist in the Western world, but it had no context in Japan. So when they looked up the word Jew, they would find something negative, and then they were simply copying it out of Western dictionaries and trying to explain to them that that's a slang and it's a derogatory slang, and that was a process. Or, for example, uh, during some of the educational reforms at that point, 100 years earlier, they decided that they should have the students read a Shakespeare play, and so I believe it was a British advisor to the Japanese Ministry of Education way back when, advised them to read Merchant of Venice. So often, the Japanese first encounter with the Jew is Merchant of Venice and Shylock.
Right.
So it's what you can almost call accidental anti-Semitism, but nonetheless it existed. And to try to get the Japanese system to change to a different Shakespeare play was very difficult because we've been reading it for decades. It's a very good play, and from the point of literature, it's considered. And actually, for those coming out of an anti-Semitic Europe, Shylock actually has a beautiful monologue. Hath not a Jew blood, body, and it's very moving. But in the context for Japanese, we had no background. It's be careful of the Jew.
Right. Right. That's fascinating. Now, moving on a bit, I'm going to jump ahead. Following your 6-year tenure in Japan, you became the Chief Rabbi of Poland in 2004, and making you the longest serving Chief Rabbi there. So can you tell us a bit about how this role came about?
Well, okay. Well, actually, the first time I traveled to Poland was in 1973. I was 18 years old. I had just finished high school. I'd never been to Israel, and um, unlike the image of all American Jews are rich, which I wish it was true, it would be great, but it's not. And at that point, American rabbis were not earning what they do today. And so I understood that my parents had 4 kids. If I wanted to go to Israel, I had to find my own money. So I started saving uh, pretty much from when I was 12 years old. By the time I finished high school, I had the money. And so I started looking for what was like a really cool trip for Jewish teenagers to go to Israel. This is, pre birthright, pre birthright by decades. Uh, and so I did find, and a friend of mine said, I'm going on this program to Israel, but it also goes to Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. 1973, from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Soviet Union, Romania, Israel. So it's unbelievable. And I was extremely excited that I was in Israel. It was also it was also an important time because it was just a few months before the Yom Kippur War. So they also gave a different perspective on Israel. Uh, and Soviet Union is unbelievable. It's the beginning of the very first détente between Nixon, Kosygin, and Brezhnev. But also the Soviet satellite countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, became fascinated with what was really left. Everybody was saying at that point that Poland had a few thousand old Jews, it was all over. And something told me that maybe it's not true. So I started traveling back to Eastern Europe, not the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was much harder to travel by yourself. You had to take an official guide, and it was very limiting. But you could travel pretty much freely, to a much greater extent freely, to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. And so I spent the summer of 76, 77, 79 in those countries. And by 79, I met the first young Poles who discovered their Jewish roots and were interested in doing something about it. So I knew all along that there was something happening, but nobody knew how big. And I always felt that if I could do something, I wanted to see if I could help. So then I finished rabbinical school. I did a master's, and after I went to Japan for 6 years. I come back to New York in the fall of 1989, just a few months after democratic elections in Poland. A couple months later, the Berlin Wall falls, and I said, well, maybe it's time to work in Eastern Europe. And by March of 1990, I was working in Poland. At first, I was working on behalf of an American Jewish foundation, the Ronald Lauder Foundation. I worked there for 8 years in Poland for the Lauder Foundation, came back to New York for 2 years, and in 2000 went back to Poland as the Rabbi of Warsaw, and then 2004 as the Chief Rabbi.
That you mentioned how when you first went there, people mentioned that the Polish community wasn't that strong. There's only a few thousand. You said that doesn't sound right, and that reminds me of this excellent TED talk that you delivered around 10 years ago, in which you said following the Holocaust and then the 1989 fall of communism in Poland, the atmosphere in the country changed, and Jews began discovering that they were of Jewish descent, prompting a revival of Poland's Jewish community, of which you have been a most important part. I'd like to know a bit more about what this revival looks like, and do you think it contradicts some people's preconceptions of Poland as a country with rampant anti-Semitism?
Okay, September 1st, 1939, the beginning of World War II. At that point, there are 3.5 million Jews living in Poland, the heart, the soul of the Ashkenazi world. Only 5 years later, 90% no longer alive, having been murdered by Germans and accomplices. That statement's so horrific, most people don't think how many survived. 10% survived. That's 350,000 Polish Jews did survive. 10% of 3.5 million. Meaning that in 1946, there were more Jews in Poland than today in the UK. So the question is, where are they? The vast majority of the survivors leave Poland in the 25 years after World War II. If you want to feel safe saying the statement, I am a Jew, it made good sense to leave post-Holocaust, Soviet-occupied, communist Poland. And so most of the Jews left. But not all the Jews left. And those that stayed, most of them agreed with those who left. Stay Jewish, leave communist Poland, stay in communist Poland, stop being Jewish, to the extent that you often didn't even tell your children and grandchildren. And so while a couple 100,000 left, some tens of thousands stayed, of which most gave up their Jewish identity, keeping the deep, dark secret of who their real identity was for 50 years, as I said, often even from their own family, from 1939 to 1989, the fall of communism. And at that point, there was a new phenomenon. People starting to tell their children and grandchildren, friends, colleagues, neighbors, that they're really Jewish. Since 1989, thousands of Poles, and perhaps I think it's probably some tens of thousands, have discovered their real Jewish roots. That's the Jewish community of Poland today. And so I had an illogical sense of this. There was nothing rational about my decision, and my sense, not decision. And so I went with it, and we discovered that somehow I was onto something. But you also asked about breaking the stereotype of anti-Semitism. As we know from history, anti-Semitism was a very strong element, unfortunately, throughout Europe before the war. All the way from Russia to Poland to France to the United Kingdom. It was not something socially unacceptable to be an anti-Semite before the war. The Holocaust changed that. The only thing is that after the Holocaust, many Jews left Poland so quickly, and the other ones were hiding, it never had a chance to deal with what does it mean to be an anti-Semite after the Holocaust. And so with the fall of communism in 1989, with the free democratic Poland, people could start to look and say, what role should anti-Semitism play in Poland today? And here there are two major factors. One is they, after 1989, with once again Poland being democratic, they were challenged with recreating the old New Poland, meaning they kept some values from before the war and they rejected others. So out went communism, out went fascism, and for many also it meant rejecting anti-Semitism that represented something from the bad old Poland. It doesn't mean everyone rejected anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean there's no anti-Semitism today, but it does mean that it's much less than what people expect.
And bringing it back to today, what are some of the challenges, as you see it, that Poland's Jewish community is facing right now?
Okay, well, I'd say that the challenges we're facing now, uh, we have qualitatively changed our challenges. 30 years ago, 25 years ago, the question is, are there any Jews? By 25 years ago is, do we have Jews? Do they want to be Jewish? Then about 20 years ago is that we have Jews, they want to be Jewish, but can we actually make a living Jewish community? Today the question is, what kind of Jewish community? And we still face tremendous challenges. But I would say one of our biggest challenges today is uh, being able to give an excellent Jewish education to our children, which is key for continuity. Another big challenge now is helping singles find other Jewish singles. So the major shift is that we've moved in 30 years from post-Holocaust, post-communist problems, almost entirely only those kind of problems, to many normal Jewish problems. In other words, the problems that we face here about in the small Jewish community, helping young adults find Jewish mates, Jewish partners, may not be that much different than Leeds or Birmingham, and so the kinds of problems we're facing have now become much more part of the normative Jewish world. So what I had said previously, it seems that things were really good. But unfortunately, about 5 years ago, things became less good than they were before, since 1989. What happened? Uh, we have to look at it within a Western world context, meaning Europe and the United States. Something happened 5, 6 years ago where it became more acceptable, more respectable to say anti-Semitic things than it was uh, than it was since the Holocaust. And this is something that happened very sadly, not only in Poland but throughout Europe and the United States. The United States may actually be the worst right now in terms of people expressing openly anti-Semitic feelings. Now, why it happened, I'm not going to try to guess. So there are elements uh, within Poland. It's a very small element, but a vocal element that have, for the first time since the fall of communism, starting about 5 years ago, expressed themselves openly being anti-Semitic. Uh, Part of it is that we have a right of center government, and that right of center government is reluctant to condemn clearly, unequivocally, acts of anti Semitism because this is part of the electorate that could possibly vote for them. And it's very challenging to persuade a politician to condemn part of his own electorate. It's what I call the Charlottesville phenomenon or syndrome, where the famous situation where there was a neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville and President Trump wasn't able to identify who are the good guys or the bad guys. It simply was that he didn't want to criticize people that might vote for him. That unfortunately happens not only in the United States but also here in Poland.
And in comparison with countries around the world, given the enormity of the toll that it took on Polish Jews, do you feel that the approach by leaders, by educators, is different in Poland than in other places?
I think that certainly post 1989 there was a tremendous sensitivity among Polish educators that they have to really teach accurately and sensitively about the Holocaust. Uh, and there's really no problem and no challenge about teaching about the Holocaust in that, the Germans did it. Whereas the sensitive point is to what extent should it be taught openly that there were Poles, not the Polish government, not the majority, but there were individual Poles who collaborated with the Germans and caused Jews to get killed. That's a major point of contention. Many polls say yes, we should talk about it. There are some polls that object to it. Unfortunately, right now, there are elements within the current government that are part of that group saying, well, to talk about it is bad for Polish pride. We shouldn't talk about it. Not in any ways to belittle it, but to put it into some kind of perspective is to what extent is it taught in the British schools today? And I don't know the behavior of British troops in India, for example, in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, or in other places in the what was then the vast British Empire, their behavior towards local populations. Uh, it's not to justify either side, but it's to put some kind of perspective and sensitivity. Of course, for we as Jews, the most important thing is being able to talk openly about anti-Semitism. But we also need to understand that there is a general reluctance, whether it's the United Kingdom or even parts of the United States or Canada, that really, or France for that matter, that don't really want to talk about the bad things they did, or the behavior of Belgium in Africa. So it doesn't justify the fact that there are Poles that don't want to talk about it, but it gives us an understanding. If we want to solve the problem, we have to understand where it's coming from. It's not coming from anti-Semitism. It's coming from we want to protect our good name. And I have a very different approach, and that is if you want to have a strong country, you need to talk also about the bad things that country did for the sake of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that, should the government shift in the next few years in Poland, the tide will change, or is this a Polish culture thing?
Uh, there are 38 million people in this country. There is no one Poland, as there is no one Britain. Uh, what do I mean by that? That Britain has left the European Union. The decision for Brexit was decided by how much of a difference between the two sides?
Gosh, I think it was like 51-49 or 52-48 or something.
Something like that. So it was almost 50-50. So in other
Yeah.
words, there you have a major issue where the country is completely split. Now, one side did get a few more votes than the other side, so therefore the Brexit did happen. I'm not talking about Brexit. I'm talking about the idea that here you have a country that, on a very important issue, is completely split. In the United States, you have the same situation. In Israel, you have often the same situation. In Poland, also. So it's not as if everyone agrees with the government. The current government, out of 460 seats in Parliament, has a majority of one or two. So again, very split. That seems to be what's happening in today's world, where countries have become really split between two different approaches. And so, yes, if the other side wins, then I'm hopeful that that will change. But even with this government, we haven't given up. We're still fighting that we have to say the truth. And by the way, I want to say that while we've had too many disappointments, there are times also when this government has said the right thing. Not enough, but people shouldn't think that it's a 100%.
Now, going to you for a second, in 2006, you were the victim of an anti-Semitic attack in which you were punched and pepper sprayed by a man reported to have ties with a Nazi organization. Can you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, well, that sounds a lot more dramatic than it was. We were walking on Shabbat afternoon after prayers. We were going to someone's home for lunch, and someone started yelling at us, Poles for Poland, which is a pre-war slogan, Poles for Poland and Jews to Palestine, meaning Jews should leave Poland. And I didn't like it. So after he yelled it the second or third time, I turned back to him and I asked him, why does he say that? Uh, and his reaction was, and I've done this a few times before. I don't I don't like hearing anti-Semitism, so if someone says something, I confront them. Now, again, I have to just say it's the middle of the day in the middle of Warsaw, some beautiful sunny day. So I was taking my chances, and he went like this. So being a New Yorker, I went like that, and then he took out pepper spray and pepper sprayed me. Now, so you could say it was kind of dumb that I did it because he could have also had a knife or something more. So, and after that, I chased him down the street. Uh, Fortunately, he got away because I have no idea what I would have done with him. Uh, and and the police actually found him, and he sat for 2 months in jail pre-trial, and then was given a suspended sentence because, after all, he sat already 2 months. But the Polish at that point, the government and the police took it very seriously.
Mm.
But it's also in the perspective of that I don't want it to happen again. But after living here, working here for 32 years, it happened once. That kind of situation. I have heard anti-Semitic things said towards me. Besides that, and when I hear it and it's appropriate, I confront them, and usually they run away.
Um, yeah, that's
I'm not advocating that other people should do that. I don't want anyone getting beaten up, but um, I've been lucky.
Is there anything scarier than a tough rabbi? I don't think so.
Tough Rebbitzin.
Yes. Um, Now that you've sort of had a few very scary incidents and close incidents throughout your life. Let's go to one 4 years later. You were supposed to be on a 2010 flight known as the Smolensk air disaster, in which 96 people, including the president of Poland, his wife, several members of the Polish parliament, and other high ranking officials, were killed. And the reason that you did not board the flight was because it left on a Saturday, which is the Jewish Sabbath. What was your reaction when you found out about this?
As we say, that's a tough one. Um, my first reaction was if the that if I was on the plane, someone else might be alive. And then I found that there were a few empty seats. It's a strange way of feeling better. But my first reaction was if it was a full flight and I was on the plane, someone else would be alive. Uh, and then, uh, of course, there's also the feeling of disbelief because I had been in Smolensk 3 days before the prime minister went, and 3 days later the president was going. So I was in the same airport on the same plane 3 days before, including some of the people on the plane with the prime minister went back. The person sitting across the aisle from me went back on Saturday with the president. He's one of the 96 people who died. Uh, it's very hard to put into words. Overwhelming. I don't. It's not very clear the next few weeks. I do know that I just spent most of my time the next 2 weeks going to funerals,
Mm.
and because these were people that I worked with, some almost daily, some from time to time. There was someone on the flight who was a personal friend. He was at my daughter's bat mitzvah because he was serving then in Washington. So he came, and my daughter was bat mitzvah in the States. So yeah, I still don't really have proper words to express how it feels.
I've read that you um, partly attributed the fact that it was the Jewish Sabbath to some sort of you know I don't know what you would call that, but it was something, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Well, listen, for a rabbi not to take a plane on Shabbat should be the most natural thing. There's nothing miraculous about it. There's nothing something unusual. I, and therefore, for me, it was clear from the beginning. I was invited, and I said no. It wasn't like I pondered it. I wondered about it. It was clear I'm not going. Shabbat is Shabbat. Sabbath is Sabbath. I'm not going. Um, So that's I. It's hard for me to. I mean, there is an old statement that says that more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath have kept the Jews, and for me that has an additional meaning.
As we wrap this up, I really want to thank you for giving us your time. For those, this is something I ask all of our guests. For those looking to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, but they may not know where to start. They may not even be Jewish. Where would you recommend they start? What do you recommend they do?
Well, the first thing is to become educated. When someone says, "Well, the Jews control the banks," then you have to look at resources. I'm sure there are resources in the United Kingdom. I'm being from New York. I know the American resources better, ADL.org and others. And then the other thing really is that when you hear something wrong, simply to try to share with the people you're with, saying, "I'm very sorry, but that's not true," you know. And for me, even more important, saying it's anti-Semitic is saying it's not true, because a person may not like Jews, but that's an emotion. The question is, what is it based on? Is that dislike for Jews coming from a true experience, or is it coming from something that's completely false? Overwhelmingly, it's coming from something false. And therefore, I think it's really important to be able to call the person out and saying, why do you say that? On the basis of what? And then that's why a person needs to be educated to be able to explain why what this person is saying is based on something that is false, that is a lie. As I like to say, perhaps not the most politically correct, if we Jews control the world, we're doing a really bad job. We should be fired.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Rabbi, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you, and in Poland or virtually?
Well, actually, when you mentioned the TEDx talk, that's a nice way to see more of what I have to say. But if people want to reach out to me, they can send me an email, which is very simple. It's my last name, Schudrich at gmail.com, Schudrich at gmail.com. But please be patient. It may take me a while to answer.
All right. Rabbi Schudrich, I really want to thank you for coming on podcast against anti-Semitism.
It's my great pleasure.